So Catherine McMahon is the founder of the Estuary Care Foundation. When was that, Catherine?
2016.
Okay, so 6 years old. And the foundation is devoted to the protection of the ecology and shorelines of South Australia's Port River and Barker Inlet. It's the topic tonight. And the main activities of the foundation are the restoration of terrestrial, intertidal and aquatic habitats, and some of these activities include shellfish restoration, and we've seen so much of that in the Gulf recently, living shorelines and seagrass restoration. So we look forward to an interesting talk, which no doubt will touch on a significant challenge to the estuary with the St Kilda mangroves that Catherine and I were involved in with the Conservation Council that were killed by the hypersaline flows from the abandoned salt fields. So welcome, Catherine. Thank you very much for coming.
Thanks.
We would like you to be in front of here so people can see you there.
Okay,
Because there's a little camera here.
Terrific. Okay.
So welcome. Thank
Lovely.
you.
Thank you so much. And in terms of me doing the slides,
Yeah.
left or right?
well, just probably left.
Or just go this way?
Yeah. Whatever.
Okay, no worries. Thanks everybody for being here in person and online. And I'd like to acknowledge that Mike Burrell, who's been one of our volunteers through the Ecological Society, is a regular contributor, I know, to this as well. So my talk's about joys and possibilities and opportunities. So some of the joys arise from the actual nature of the estuary itself, the Port River and Barker Inlet estuary. So on both sides of Torrens Island, that it really contributes to sustaining life. It offers a whole range of ecosystem services. It's actually now in a process of significant recovery with vastly reduced pollution into the system. And it now has status as a swimmable river. So going through some of those things, what you can see here are some of the major habitat that we have. So the seagrass, this is Zostra, which is increasingly kind of moving down, particularly alongside of Torrens Island. We do some monitoring there, and this is how it looks at low tide. If you're actually going down the river, you sort of see it as a bit of a green haze when the tide is out. If you're closer to the shore and you're going over it, then it's kind of about sort of yay high and quite sort of thin, about 10 centimetres tends to be the max height that we get. Mangroves, of course, are really the dominant species that we see. Samphires are found, particularly now on Torrens Island. We've lost a significant area of samphires in an area called Mutton Cove. And I'll show also, one of the opportunities we're really committed to is sort of particularly the restoration of mangroves and samphires in that Dried Creek area. And then shellfish I found just absolutely everywhere, and that's how Mike has come to be involved in our project. So the Pacific oysters are just there in the absolute kind of millions. We've got a smaller number of mussels. We get a lot of these conical barnacles, and the Pacific oysters are feral, of course, but they are filter feeders. And so while they absolutely kind of dominate our wooden structures and our wharves and other things, one of the good things about them is their capacity to filter the water. And one of the things we say about native oysters, which I think is probably true for Pacific oysters as well, is that an adult oyster filters about a bathtub of water every day. So it's really they're making a significant contribution to enhancing. That's a Pacific oyster. So no, it's a whole range of them. So they look different than they do. I mean, when they're grown for market, then they go through a whole process of tumbling in order to knock off the new growth. What the oyster growers are doing is sort of seeking to have the muscle grow, not to have the outer shell. When we first started our work with native oysters, which you'll see later, within 3 weeks of being in the river, they were growing new sort of outer shell, this luminescent shell on the outside. That's not of such interest to the oyster growers. So what you're getting is a shell that's been tumbled in order that that they can get the food. Yeah, that's right.
That's the Pacific
What you're seeing there is a picture of a Pacific oyster. So the Pacific oysters are an intertidal oyster, and they're the ones that you're going to see really visibly if you come down and visit around the river and you walk down onto the pontoons and you look at the wharfs, for example, you'll see masses of these Pacific oysters. Because they're intertidal, they're going to be visible, whereas our native oysters are a subtidal species. Yep. So these are some of the ecosystem services that the estuary provides in terms of erosion control, filtering our stormwater. The area is really important, you might know, is nursery grounds for our fishing industries and our prawn industry. I'll talk some more about their capacity to sequester carbon. They provide important habitat services, and that's true for butterflies, but it tends to be our dolphins and our migratory birds that get the most attention. Pollination, of course, and then a whole range of services to the community. So one of the really important things that's made some of our work possible is the reduction of the pollution into the estuary. So one of those significant events was the closure of Penrice. So when the glass factory no longer needed what Penrice supplied and the salt fields, there was a whole cascade that happened sort of there. So that was 2013-14 that Penrice closed, and they used to have a license to pollute basically into the river. And it certainly seems as though the seagrass, it's our understanding that the restoration of the seagrass has really come about in part because of that reduction in that pollution load from Penrice. And certainly the people who work along the river as well, like the guys at the Subcorp and whatever, say they see a very discernible kind of difference. And the other thing is Bolivar comes in, at the top of the estuary. So all the increasing improvements that are made there, for example, like taking the water out to Barossa Valley, those things also help minimise the pollutant load into the estuary. So this is just an indication from the EPA that in 2019, 83% of their water quality objectives were met. So some of the challenges are these: sea level rise. We also are subject to land subsidence. So with those, of course, comes the risk of flooding. We certainly have an issue around sustaining the life of the dolphin community, and that's been really difficult because it's not been apparent what the cause of the death of 5 dolphins has been in the estuary. So a great deal of work has been done on that, and whether it's something that's happening more broadly across the dolphin population isn't known. I mean, this is a dolphin population that's monitored much more closely, whether it's things like through the food chain, the accumulation of toxins. So there isn't anything that yet has been identified as the cause of that, and that's the cause of great concern, of course, to many people. And one of the challenges, of course, is that we've got lots of industry. We've got our gas and electricity providers. We've got Adelaide Brighton Cement. We've got people who live, of course, as residents. So there's multiple stakeholders. We've got the Dolphin Sanctuary. We've got the International Bird Sanctuary. So there's lots of people with a whole range of different interests. And of course, we're still a major port in South Australia. So in relation to sea level rise, these are just a couple of indications. The one on the left maps various scenarios from an Australian government document from a few years ago of what the outlook could be based on different possible scenarios, which low growth or high growth paths. And the one on the right comes from our council's climate adaptation plan, which we did in conjunction with West Torrens and Charles Sturt. And while it doesn't include Torrens Island, because none of them are responsible for them, Torrens Island is particularly at risk as well. In other models that I see, it's kind of covered. So these are a couple of examples of how the flooding risk is kind of shown. May 2016, there was a major event all around the state. There were impacts felt in lots of places across South Australia. And this is the end of Semaphore Road in May 2016. So the water came from a couple of, so it's the end that's closest to where the Birkenhead Tavern sort of is and the Birkenhead Bridge. And below that, this is a photo taken at Mutton Cove. So what used to be a small tidal creek that was fed from the river into what was called the Mutton Cove Conservation Reserve, but wasn't actually gazetted as such. It's Crown land. What was a tidal creek actually became a whole kind of flooded area. And that's when the seawall collapsed. And that seawall has continued to disintegrate. So, this whole area gets regularly flooded. And what was samphires and mangroves is now pretty much all mangroves. And the one on the right is the sort of thing I seek to share on social media to try and say to our authorities, actually, this is a risk that arises sort of regularly. So you can see Harts Mill off on the left. This is the Sea Scouts. It's again near to that area in May 2016. And while it didn't lead to anything like this kind of flooding, it's just kind of saying, hey, without some kind of attention to these issues, people's homes are going to get flooded. So where are the opportunities? So obviously one of them is in climate adaptation. And one of the ways of doing that, where it's possible, is with something called living shorelines. A further opportunity, which I mentioned in relation to the sequestering carbon, is in relation to blue carbon. And the other one is around community wellbeing. And it is possible to do, I think, all of these things together. So in relation to climate adaptation, our council has since 2005 actually been looking at the risks, documenting them and then looking at engineering studies about how this might be addressed. It's not actually their responsibility to make sure that, for example, the seawalls are tall enough. It's a state and a federal. Increasingly, it's being recognised as a federal government responsibility, which is really good because, as we're seeing in New South Wales, the scale of these problems is really, really significant. And I was hearing the New South Wales Emergency Services Minister say this morning that 97% of our funding goes on responding to disasters and only 3% on mitigation. And that has to be turned around. Like the insurance industry has been saying that for years. So the main reason that we were formed was actually to look at this issue of sea level rise and the risks and how that might be addressed. So we've had a bit of a breakthrough in that a submission has gone to Infrastructure Australia, and that's gone from, it was work that was done as a national case study that involved the CSIRO, the council and the state government, Infrastructure SA. And a submission went at the end of last year. So Infrastructure Australia are the people who sign off on, yeah, it's a worthwhile project to say extend the south southern freeway or whatever. So that's the organisation that looks at these large scale infrastructure projects. So the fact that something's going forward saying, how might we develop a business case for this area is really positive. The other thing that's positive is that where the last government was just starting to commit $50 million a year for disaster readiness, the new government has said they'll commit $200 million per year. And the only difficulty with that is, of course, as we see in New South Wales, that the scale of the challenges are so great that, the call on that money is also going to be very great. So this is an example of a living shoreline. So Perry Coleman, who did this drawing, is someone that Jerry and I work closely with in the Save St Kilda Mangroves Alliance. You probably heard Perry on ABC Radio or something. She'd been in the States doing a study tour when I rang her up in 2015 and said, I don't quite know what I'm asking, Perry, about how can we address sea level rise when government agencies don't seem to have any money or want to put money towards these things. And she introduced me to this idea, which she said in our context would be a multi-species shellfish reef, seagrass, samphires, and mangroves. And one of the things, of course, you need is the space in order to be able to do this instead of doing something like a hard seawall. So that's one of our limitations in such a built-up area. Oh, did I miss one? No, all good. So in terms of sequestering carbon, this whole area is getting more publicity, and Penny Wong was in the news just a week or so ago in terms of more international developments that are occurring in this space. It's just occurred to me, and I've forgotten the actual details. But there's an increasing interest around the world in looking at how we can capture carbon in these coastal ecosystems, which are the three things I was just talking about. And this is some information which comes via Alice Jones from the University of Adelaide, which shows how much carbon is stored in the soils and in the biomass, comparing them between tropical forests, seagrass, boreal forests, seagrass, salt marsh, and mangroves. And Alice advises that in the South Australian context, while the mangroves store a lot more carbon because we've got more seagrass, then the actual percentage of carbon that seagrass contributes in South Australia is greater. But you can see the potential with salt marsh and with mangroves in terms of pulling carbon out of the atmosphere and storing it. And of course, blue carbon's got to go through the same processes that are occurring with land-based work, where you've got to look at a period of time and how much carbon is being stored. And it also varies in different parts of the world. That even the same seagrass might, store a different amount of carbon. So there's a lot of research happening in this space around the world. This is an indication of, how those processes kind of work. And one of the opportunities that Jerry and I see with the Dry Creek salt fields is that there would be so many benefits if what we could do is to restore those salt fields, which are not an economically viable proposition as a salt field, into mangroves and samphires and a process of restoration of that area, which would offer tremendous opportunities for blue carbon. It would also protect our bird sanctuary, because with sea level, where the bird sanctuary is currently along the coast, with sea level rise, we're not going to have bird sanctuary in about 20, 25 years, unless we've got areas for retreat. So this is something that we're hoping is going to emerge. in relation to wellbeing, one of the new projects that our council is going to commit significant funds to is an Aboriginal Cultural Centre at Western Regional Reserve. And one part of that is going to be a living shoreline. So what you can see on the right is how they'll reshape the landscape there. It's right near Bower Road, where the railway line, close to where the railway line crosses over the Port River. The centre is going to be there, and we're going to have a much larger demonstration of what a living shoreline is than what the foundation's been able to achieve. And what I hope will be a possibility might be that there could be an Indigenous ranger there who could undertake education programs sort of around the river, because we get a lot of interest from schools and other groups. The other possibility we're pursuing is a swimming pool for the river. And one of the reasons for doing that is came both from being able to sort of celebrate the improved sort of health of the river, but also to try and engage a whole lot more people with the river. So in lots of ways, we've got to overcome a lot of attitudes that have been formed about pollution and whatever in the river. And we are now at the stage where it's a swimmable river, and the North Haven Surf Life Saving Club, who we're partnering with, has successfully run long swims through the river in 2017 and 19. And the council's going to have a sports kind of festival, aquatic sports festival, sort of on the river. So one of the things that we can do is sort of join the cities around the world who are now kind of billing themselves as having sort of swimmable sort of rivers. And I think our chances are much greater than the Torrens, actually, of being able to do that in a timely kind of way. So when I look at the facilities, for example, in a place like Copenhagen, or if you look at the Parramatta River in Sydney, those of you who might know about, that was a similar river in terms of lined by industry and the like. And they're putting a series of swimming facilities into that river as part of their process of giving back to or saying to the community, this is one of the ways in which you can benefit from what this environment's got to offer. But, we don't want to lose sight at all of the fact that it's a living system, and there are all the creatures that live within that. Some of the things that we've done, which Jerry has mentioned, as well as the trials that we've done, we're also keen to see some kind of governance structure for the river. And one of the things that we're working on at present is something that we'll probably call a watershed plan, which is what we see as possible futures for the river and the kind of future we'd like to see emerge. This is some of our work with the native oysters. So there's a picture of some native oysters there, and some of the spat, the little golden things that are on the tiles there are the spat of the native oysters, and this is where we've done some small scale reefs. And the federal government has just given us, or is giving through to Ozfish some significant money to continue the restoration of the native oysters. This is a couple of our volunteers doing some seagrass monitoring. We tried a restoration trial, which is the one sort of down here. That wasn't successful. It could have been a whole range of things, but human interference possibly came into it. Looked as though a boat had struck some of it. So SARDI have gone back to first base to try and look at, when does the Zostra flower, when does it seed? Would it be possible to collect seed and do restoration trials in that way? Because we were trying to take the ready formed plants from one part of the river across to another part, and using some polypipe. And it could have been our technique as well. It wasn't successful.
replanting.
I would imagine so around the world. I can't say. Yeah. But we were advised by Jason Tanner from SARDI as to how to do that technique. And we got permission, of course, from Native Edge and whatever to do it. But yeah, hard to know. We were trying to protect the seagrass cores with coir bags filled with Pacific oyster shells. But of course, if the coir bags are lost, then the seagrass isn't going to take hold. And we were trying as well on the west side of the river, which isn't where we get the seagrass at present. We tend to get it all along the western side of Torrens Island, not on the other side. Okay. So this is where we've done our living shoreline trial and our living seawall. And Mike was involved in that and in our shellfish restoration sort of work. So again, that involved, because we were dealing with tiny sums of money, it involved us getting coconut fibre coir bags, filling them with Pacific oyster shell and hoping that that shellfish would settle on that to create a small intertidal reef. That's what this was about. And then planting baby mangroves. So about 30% of the mangroves have lasted. And we see the bags are kind of really useful to shorebirds for feeding. And there's been a build-up of the land behind the bags. So in that sense, the bank has been kind of extended there. But it's the same's happened in New South Wales. We were trying this following work that Ocean Watch did in New South Wales. They haven't found that the shellfish colonise on the shell there either, which is a shame because it would have been a good low-cost solution if it worked. These are some of the community engagement type things that we do. And I've got some little books over there about the Port River. They're free if you want to take one of those. So Perry Coleman, who we were talking about earlier, has done the drawings for those, and through some government grants, sort of small amounts through Green Adelaide, and then our council, we've been able to produce those. We did a cleanup along the Port River because, there's still some evidence of old industrial things that could usefully go. And we took these bollards off the shoreline and put them in front of the Girl Guides and at one of the sailing clubs. Somebody actually got married there, so that was it came as a bit of a surprise. And sort of, so that's us. Anyone's got any questions? Oh, sorry, I'll stand in front of you. So Jerry's just asking, is there a series of special activities we run during the spring and summer? We've tended more to do things in sort of like in History Festival. Mike's been involved when we've done Port Oyster Tales and Bubbles, for example, event, or Sala. I absolutely agree with what you're saying about the combination of art and science. So for us, that's, for example, been doing, having a couple of Sala exhibitions. So I approached some places kind of locally to have a venue, and then, approached artists and whatever to try and allow people to see the estuary through the eyes of artists. Increasingly people in the arts are really interested in the environment, aren't they? And so someone like Laura Wills, who was mentioned, who's doing that caterpillar outside the same museum. One of the things that we're working with Laura on is a labyrinth, a painted labyrinth. We're trying to we've got some money from the council, and we want to get the remainder of the money from the arts department to have a painted nature-based kind of labyrinth just near the folklore sort of cafe. So I think it's been more around those things, holding your question, holding events, in relation to those specific. A nature festival too. They're they're good vehicles, aren't they, for getting the publicity?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So this is about the Dry Creek salt fields and what would it take to do that restoration work and what would it cost? And it's something that the government would fund. So there's been a small scale trial in an area of the salt fields, and the EPA insisted that there had to be some very expensive tidal gates go in so that some monitoring could occur of what was moving in and out. They never found they had to use the gates. And so hopefully, I mean, what you're seeking to do is it depends which areas of the salt field are and how much salt's in them and things, because we don't want the kind of problems we've had. But a lot of the salt fields could actually just be opened up to tidal flows. And then you'd get that restoration of the samphires on the areas that are flooded some of the time and the mangroves growing along sort of the tidal creeks. And because companies, for example, are interested in carbon offsets, there's lots of companies looking to buy carbon offsets. Some companies are required to, others are seeking to for their reputation. So it's possible to get, money from companies if you can establish how much carbon is going to be stored, money from philanthropic groups. An organisation like the Nature Conservancy has said that there's international philanthropic funding that they can access for things like this. And then from the government's perspective, like if Adelaide's going to be carbon neutral as a city, we're going to need carbon offsets as well. So investing in a project like this is a way potentially of doing that. So the question's been about consultation with Kaurna people and whether there's been recognition of significant places for Kaurna people. So, yes, certainly when I first embarked on this work in beginning of 2016, then I reached out to Michael O'Brien, who is Lewis O'Brien's sort of son. And we also went looking, particularly with the shellfish restoration project, because we started in January of 2016, in fact, before the foundation started. So we looked at what kind of information was there. And we found, for example, in the Healy mural, that's at the Visitors Information Centre, then there was representation of the shellfish reefs. And some of our volunteers looked into Trove, and we found that the native oyster beds were found close to the entrances of some of the tidal sort of creeks. And there was, in fact, a map that marked out where one of those beds sort of had been. The other information we found really useful was Charles Sturt and City Port Adelaide Enfield had done cultural mapping, and Carl Telfer and Gavin. Gavin? No, it was, sorry, I've forgotten his name, but it's on the Charles Sturt website. There was a whole kind of indication of what the river had been like, because of course it used to be joined to the Torrens sort of river. So it was kind of a mapping of sort of the landscape and then the way in which people had kind of lived. So one of the things that Michael sort of said to me, which isn't uncommon in a way, is that because they had been displaced, so many of the Kaurna people had been displaced from that area, they didn't necessarily have the knowledge to be able to help us with something like shellfish restoration or a seagrass restoration project. There is a place, for example, with a place called Latalari Reserve, which is named after an Aboriginal woman whose descendants are still kind of living locally. And that's a small reserve that Renewal SA did when the Newport Keys development was undertaken. So that's an important, though small, sort of site. The Aboriginal Cultural Centre will be really important. One of the other projects I'm working on with a colleague is actually a coastal native foods plants labyrinth up at Taparoo, right near where the police academy used to be. And so hopefully there might be an opportunity for people if they want to, you know, whether it's tourism businesses or just a celebration of their culture, to be able to say, these were our coastal native food plants. You know, here's an area where there's still a record of how Latalari kind of lived and her descendants, and then the Aboriginal Cultural Centre. And then there is a trail as well, and the council is keen to actually enhance that, because some of it, there's some yellow emus, for example, that are along the river that are part of that trail. But yeah, there needs to be a much better kind of representation of that story. So one of the things that's an issue, for example, in relation to dredging or to something like the swimming pool, if we were going to be putting in sort of structures, is not to be disturbing those sort of heavy metals. And yes, yeah, sorry, I had a thought and I've forgotten it.
Will never go away.
Well, it's hard to imagine it's going to be removed. One of the proposals that Mike developed for us was to try and look at doing some research that's been done elsewhere in the world in terms of where the shellfish you would find sort of heavy metals sort of in the shellfish. It's not a project we've been able to get an honours or a PhD student to take up as yet. But yeah, that's certainly an issue. I know what I was going to say, which was the fishes. So people aren't meant, for example, to put down their anchors, for example, in the river. So you can fish, people kayak and fish and things like that, but you know, no putting down anchors in terms of disturbing those heavy metals. Yeah, there is a pollutant load there, for sure.
Yeah. Okay, any other questions? No, if not, Jan, would you like to come and vote of thanks to Catherine?
Thank you, Catherine. I was just thinking as you were talking, this is our backyard, and we really don't know a lot about it. It's been fantastic to hear your discussion and some of the things that are happening, some of the risks and the way forward. So I really appreciate you coming. And we all like to put our hands together and say thank you. You've got one of the very last, all signed by the three of the surviving authors. In fact, there's only really two of us left now, but then Roger, of course, is in here. So you've got one that's signed by everybody.
Oh, thank you so much. If you don't mind, I might give it to the Point Environment Centre.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because I chair that. And
so that was a wonderful talk. I really appreciate you coming in. Thank you very much.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you. Thank you.